No, it's a good way to start. The phone is ringing, which I'm not going to answer. So, welcome to another session. Today we're going to work through the thinking systemically segment and sort of try and give you a sense of why I put that piece there and what it's intended to accomplish. In terms of updates, there have been not many changes to the environment. It seems to have really settled down as of late, which I think is a good thing. So that, as I noted in the news update that went out on Sunday, it's good if the environment finally settles down, so that you can focus on the content as opposed to worrying about what it is that's changed in the environment lately. And I hope you're finding the news update that goes out on Sunday useful. I'm finding it sort of beneficial from my perspective to sort of tidy up or pull together the things that have surfaced over the last week and provide them as info and sort of a nudge to remind you that you ought to be working on the content, realizing that people are in fact working through the content at their own pace. The other thing that I would like to note is that a number of people are developing stock and flow simulation models and having difficulty with them. The intent of this program was not to turn people into stock and flow simulation model developers. There hasn't been sufficient information provided for you to be much more than dangerous in terms of doing simulations. It was to provide you a sense of the difference between rich pictures and causal loop diagrams and simulation models. There was enough about simulation models or doing simulations, I thought, to give you a sense of how they were different and how they worked and how to build some simple ones. The intent is in September to offer an 8-segment program on developing stock and flow simulation models, because there's an enormous number of ins and outs about it, and there are, just to give you a sense of how deep it is, Edith asked a question this morning, which is a marvelous question that I can't imagine I don't know the answer to. And I played with Insight Maker for a half hour, and I still haven't got it figured out. But when I get it figured out, I'll post the answer. But there's just a lot there. So if you're concerned about a level of uncomfortableness associated with developing stock and flow simulation models, don't be so uncomfortable. The expectation is that, or the understanding is that you really haven't been given sufficient amount of information and building blocks to really become good at developing stock and flow models. Which is not to say, if you want to develop them, I'm not telling you to stop. I'm simply saying that, at this point, I would expect that you would feel uncomfortable doing it, because I don't think you've had enough to actually learn most of the ins and outs about going about it. Yes, Julio, you are dangerous. We're all dangerous one way or another. Also, I've scheduled a 4-week composite web session this afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern Time and Thursday morning at 10 a.m. in case anyone wants to attend those as sort of composite catch-ups. Though for today's session, the subject at hand was thinking systemically, and I hope that over the 4 sessions you've got a sense that each session has tried to lead you a little bit deeper down the rabbit hole, or hopefully really to give you more and more complex models that are intended to be more and more realistic as we have progressed through them. So that there was, in thinking systemically, there was nothing really new. though the models that I tried to offer had a sense of connected with reality, as opposed to some of the stuff that was done in the prior sections, though all of the ones that were offered were rich pictures and causal loop diagrams, because the intent was, I mean, if you finish this program and are comfortable doing rich pictures and causal loop diagrams that help you better understand the relationships associated with the situation and can convey that understanding to other people, then I think that you have successfully made it, have picked up on what I tried to offer in this program. So in terms of the specific models in this segment, I mean, I'm not sure what I should cover today, unless there are specific questions about how some of these models were put together. And if there are questions about other things, I suppose I can answer them also. I mean, the intent was not to walk through them. I mean, the intent was for you to walk through some or all of the models prior to this session, and if there are questions about them, then I can answer them. So let's see. Harry wants to know, for clarifying how to follow loops, could you show or explain step by step how more effective action balancing loop is working in the model new learning inhibited? Oh, well, this, where is that one? This one has been the source of a number of questions. So that the idea here was that given a problem to solve and beginning with the perception that we approach that problem with outdated thinking, communicating, and learning skills, those two together leads to inappropriate action. And the inappropriate action simply creates new problems, which adds to the problems to be solved. What ought to happen is that these new problems should lead to new learning, which would reduce our outdated thinking, communicating, and learning. Though the difficulty arises because that outdated thinking, communicating, and learning actually inhibits the new learning, so the new learning that would reduce this doesn't happen, so that we end up with a learning inhibited loop, with this sort of being our own worst enemies. Then what often happens is the typical type of intervention, someone tries to help us overcome our outdated thinking, communicating, and learning, and the typical response to the typical intervention is that it causes us to present defensive routines on our own part, which inhibits our new learning and therefore doesn't actually improve the situation. So I have another reinforcing loop where I am being my own worst enemy. And in terms of reading the loops, this is a balancing influence, and this is a balancing influence, so this ends up being a reinforcing loop. This is a reinforcing influence, a reinforcing influence, a balancing influence, and a reinforcing influence, so this is a balancing loop. If you walk the loop and the number of balancing influences is odd, then it's a balancing loop. If it's 0 or even, then it's a reinforcing loop, which is why this loop, which is positive, positive, negative, and negative, so there's an even number of balancing influences, so it's another reinforcing loop. And then, though, what happens is an insightful intervention done in such a way which isn't fully described in the diagram itself, though if you read this paper by Argyris about teaching smart people how to learn, it's very helpful in terms of beginning to get one to see that they are actually being their own worst enemy. And when this insightful intervention overcomes the negative influence of these two loops, then the new learning begins to happen, and you have a reinforcing loop that's virtuous as opposed to these two which are vicious, and the new learning actually begins to happen. So this diagram was an outgrowth of a discussion on the systems in the systems thinking world group, and I don't know, there were probably 75 or 100 posts from different people as we worked through our thoughts to come to this point. Not to say that it's completely finished. It's a perspective on a situation at this point. Can we get back to this question also in the forum if you prefer? I'm sorry, Harry, I don't know what can we get back to what question? Is there another question? Well, if there aren't any questions specifically about these pieces, are there questions about any other portion of the program to this point? I mean, you got me here, you may as well abuse me. This is not working out well. Well, I'm sort of at a loss for words. Some of you, it's a little early. Yeah, it's a little early on the West Coast, though. Some of you must have some questions. I find it difficult to move from rich pictures to C and E diagrams and then to stock and flow. When and how to translate a picture into a stock is not clear to me. Okay. If you, let me start, wow, all right, this one already is a picture. If I start with something, let me go, okay. Whether you, all right, to get from a rich picture to a causal loop diagram should be relatively straightforward in terms of simply figuring out what the influences are that you've already identified and adding the loop indicators to those places where there are loops. You shouldn't have to draw any, well, you may in fact identify additional relations that you want to add to the diagram. Let me go find this. Now, this one was purposely put together so that it is a rich picture, so that it's simply a set of relationships and indications of what those relationships are. Though it's not, as it stands at this point, it is not a causal loop diagram. Though to take it from a rich picture to a causal loop diagram, all one needs to do is to identify whether the influences are balancing or reinforcing, and identify the loops and label them accordingly. Now, as I had said before, balancing loops always are attempting to bring something into balance, which means they have a goal associated with them, so that the best thing to label them is what it is that they're attempting to accomplish. So B1 is a boredom relief loop, in that the boy wants attention and is bored and is trying to overcome that, which is why this is a boredom relief. Reinforcing loops are intended to cause something to grow or increase, and that which they're really trying to increase is what's usually appropriate for the label on the loop itself, so that this is a loop intended to reduce belief, and this one improves belief. And this one is balancing, but this one is reinforcing, simply because of the number of, this particular loop goes from here, there's one balancing to here, two balancing and back, so that it's a reinforcing loop because there are two balancing influences in it. In the other one, there's only one. It goes from here to truth, to belief-o-meter, to people, to center of attention, to release boredom, and back to cry wolf. And there's only one balancing influence, so it's a balancing loop. And that balancing loop is attempting to improve the belief, so that to get from a rich picture to a causal loop diagram should be relatively straightforward. To get from a causal loop diagram to a stock and flow diagram is another task altogether. The difference being that the first thing that you should do is to determine which things are the stocks. And you don't, in other words, you can draw a stock and flow diagram just as a picture, not intended to be a simulation. And it should be more informative than just a causal loop diagram, because of the inclusion of which things are the stocks and what's flowing back and forth. Oftentimes in a causal loop diagram, it's difficult to understand what the stocks are and what's flowing. If you're just going to draw a picture, then you can do the conversion by just changing the elements to say, well, this is a stock and here's what's flowing into it, and in that direction. If you're actually going to develop a simulation, my recommendation is start from scratch. Find out where the center is, or the beginning, and you should know because you labeled this B1, so that is the way that the story is meant to unfold, and build the simulation piece by piece by piece, so that you build a little and you test a little, and every piece you add has to work, so that you in other words, there's been a number of questions from people about, well, I built this whole model and it's not working and I'm not quite sure why. Well, if you're not quite sure why it's not working, it should be due to the last thing you added to the model, because everything that you added up to that point should have been tested to make sure that it works. To build a stock and flow simulation model, I start with a stock and a flow. And I make sure that it does what I think it should do. And then I add another stock and a flow, or I add a variable. But every time I add something, I test it, so that I know that if it's not working, it's because of the last piece I added, as opposed to somewhere amidst these 15 different pieces, it's just not working. Now, it took a long time of me actually causing great pain for myself to learn that, because I used to build a model and put in all of the equations and all the variables, and it didn't work. And I would spend hours trying to figure out where it was that the model was wrong or my assumptions were wrong, because it just didn't work. And then, because in Insight Maker it takes one click to test the model, build a little bit, and run it. And when that piece does what you think it's supposed to do, then add another piece to it. And before you add that piece, think to yourself, okay, when I add this piece, here's how it should behave. And your thought about how it should behave may or may not be correct. So that you may add a piece and it behaves the way that you expect it to, or the way it most often happens for me. I add a piece and it doesn't behave the way I expect it to, which is opportunity for me to learn that there's something wrong with the model, or there's something wrong with what I expect, though it's a constant trial and learning to continue to evolve the pieces and ensure that the interaction is functioning step by step by step, as opposed to, here, I built this whole model and it doesn't work, and I've been hours now trying to figure out why. And if that is the case, my recommendation is throw it away and start over again with a stock and a flow. So, okay. Hope that helps, Gerd. Can I demonstrate building a stock and flow model that includes an if-then-else equation? Create a stock. And there seems, at least on my machine, there's a bug this morning in terms of how every time I go to modify units for an element, it deletes, and I try to edit it, hit the backspace key, it deletes the element. So the flow is, so where is it? I don't know. General, if then else. If I don't know, I gotta test if A is greater than 10, then 1, else 2. All right. I would explain this as I'm building it, though I'm not sure what I'm building at the moment, though. The question, all right, so I have a stock and I have a flow into it, and the flow is 1 or 2 depending upon if A is greater than 10. But first I have to create A and create a link from A to here so that it's not actually A, it's got to be this A. And I'll make a slider and the value from 0 to 100 in steps of 1. So right now it says the stock starts out at 0, and the flow, if the value of A is greater than 10, the value of the flow is 1, otherwise it's 2. So if I just run this, it's actually increasing by 2 each time. If I turn this off and look at the value of A, I can't see it, it's buried in there. Add a display, tell it that I want it to be a tabular display, and I want to display A so I can see the value of it. All right, A is, why is A 0? Oh, A is 0 because okay. And then I'll look at the value also of what? Of the flow. Okay, so A is 0 and the flow is 2. If I change this to make this 71. Notice that it's increasing much more slowly. The value of A is 71 and the flow is 1, so that the flow is looking at the value of A to decide whether or not it wants to use 1 or 2. So that's kind of off the cuff. Okay. Let me not mess up this model. Jennifer asks a question about sustainable capitalism. Thinking when limiting factors were viewed solely as capital and workforce, capitalism was driven, measured this way. Now, wait a minute, I'm not. Jennifer, the question is too long for me to absorb and be able to come up with an answer in a moment or two. Why don't you post the question to the discussion? I know. See, this is the bad thing about long involved questions and somebody not interpreting them, because I have about 5 seconds to absorb what the question is and try and come up with an answer. And people have asked questions on the discussion forum, and I have thought about them for hours before I answered them. So, I mean, I'll do what I can. Somebody have another short question? Okay, this was, let's see, was it? There was a model that created quite a bit of confusion last week. Was it here? Which one was it? Sorry, I'll find it. It was. I'm sorry. Somebody remember what it was? There was a question about the influence. Customer. I remember. Business and its customer. This model seemed to create a lot of confusion. It created so much confusion that it confused me. I said that I prefer the plus and the minus notation as opposed to the S and the O notation because it has a tendency to be more appropriate in certain contexts where the S and the O notation can be absolutely incorrect. If the value, and you read it, it's an overloaded definition to say that either value adds to customer sat or customer sat changes in the same direction as value. And it depends upon what customer sat is. If you think about pouring coffee into a coffee cup, as I pour coffee into the coffee cup, the amount of coffee in the cup increases. And if I pour more slowly, the amount of coffee in the cup still increases. Even though I've decreased the rate at which I'm pouring, I still end up with more coffee in the cup. And if I completely stop pouring, I still have coffee in the cup. In this particular instance, value, as I increase value, I should have more customer satisfaction. Though if I decrease value, I should have less customer satisfaction, so that their customer sat changes in the same direction as value. And if there is no value, there's no customer satisfaction. It's not a stock. It's a relationship to value, or so I interpreted it when I built this causal loop diagram. So that if I go all the way back to the endpoint, this was the place that it created confusion, in that as business focuses more on its own self-success, it then creates less value, which means that there is less customer sat, which means that there is greater demand for this other supplier, which creates less demand on the business itself, which decreases the business because it's not selling as much. So that this is a balancing loop that's self-stabilizing, because as the business focuses more on its own success, it diminishes its business so that it doesn't have the resources to continue to focus on its own self-success. If it's paying attention, it has to begin to focus more on getting back to basics and creating value for its customers. Otherwise, it will end up destroying itself. Marcia asks, but they are changing in this. Yes. In this instance, as when value increases, customer sat increases, and when value decreases, customer sat decreases. So that in this instance, this means the plus means changing in the same direction. If this was a stock, it would be read as value adds to customer sat. And if value went away, there'd still be some customer sat. But customer sat doesn't behave like a stock. It behaves like a variable, in that if this goes away, there's none of this left. So while the definition can be confusing because it's overloaded, I prefer to be confused about the definition than use a different labeling, which in certain cases is just completely wrong in terms of the S and the O notation. Okay. Other questions? Are we going to have a short session today? With regard to certification that a number of people have asked about, that the intent is beginning in the next segment, Enable a Better Tomorrow. The segment that you're supposed to be reviewing this week is about a single model. It's one model that you get in multiple pieces. And based upon developing an understanding of that model, the task at hand is to begin to develop that model for some real situation that you have an emotional attachment to. And you will then sort of evolve that model, because network magic and AR period reduction are simply examples of that model to help you better understand the model. And the assignments for both of those is to elaborate the model that you started in segment 5. Archetypes and virtual system inquiry are additional meaningful things for your toolbox, as is Kumu mapping. Though the intent is that for the certification segment, you continue to develop that model that you started in segment 5 and revised and continue to add to based upon what you learned in the other segments. And hopefully, in other words, I believe that the model that you end up developing will be more meaningful if you actually go and work with the stakeholders that are relevant to the model that you're developing and present it at the end as to demonstrate that I understand the concepts that have been presented and I'm able to use them and apply them to a real life situation, so that there's only one test associated with the entire program. When it started out, it said, well, you have to attend 9 of the 12 sessions and you have to complete all of these assignments, and the important there's no reason to confuse activity with accomplishment. The question is, have you comprehended the content to a point where you can use it? Can you demonstrate that you understand it and can use it to benefit you? So that's what the certification piece is about. It's about developing a model associated with the situation. What is the situation? What are the appropriate ways to address that situation in conjunction with the stakeholders to actually produce a different outcome? So, Timo wants an explanation or a situation where the S and the O notation are completely wrong. Okay. Consider the one I use all the time is production and inventory. And if I use the S notation to say that the inventory changes in the same direction as production increases, inventory increases. As production decreases, inventory decreases, which is absolutely false. All other things held constant, if production decreases, inventory still increases, just not quite so fast, which is why I have a problem with the S and the O notation, because there are instances where it gives one the wrong sense of the influence. So, hope that helped, Timo. And that turns out to be true any time that you're dealing with the stock, the same way that I talked about filling the coffee cup. You know, as I fill the coffee cup faster, as I pour faster, it gets fuller faster. As I pour more slowly, it still gets fuller, just not so fast. Stephen says, I have found that notation to block student thinking. Which notation? The plus and the minus, or the S and the O? Oh, well, good. I'm glad it's not the other one. Marcia asks, wait, isn't that what the S means? It changes in the same. If production decreases, inventory does go down at a similar rate. The influence is intended to, let me find something. Oh, no. Right. The intent of an influence is, with all other things held equal, so that this representation is an intent of how this influences this, all other things remaining the same. So that if this were, well, this is a variable, so that the plus sign and the S would produce exactly the same result here. Though if this were a stock, the S notation would be inappropriate, because it would say that as this increases, the stock increases, and as this decreases, the stock decreases. And it's simply not the case, because what is adding to the stock is still adding to the stock, just not so fast. So the stock is continuing to get bigger. Part of this points out the limitations that you run into. In other words, rich pictures are just pictures. Causal loop diagrams are pictures or labels with a definition of influences, though there's still not the level of clarity that's provided by a stock and flow diagram, because the stocks and the flows and the variables and the links are explicit, and in the causal loop diagram, they're not explicitly identified. They're confused. I mean, things could be one or the other, and you oftentimes don't know how the developer of the causal loop diagram was actually considering certain things. I mean, there are instances where you could consider the population to be a variable, or you could consider it to be a stock. If the population is considered to be a constant throughout the context of this particular model that I'm developing, then I can treat it as a variable, because it's not going to change. Though if what's happening in the model is dependent upon the population, and the population increases because of births and it decreases because of deaths, then I need to treat it as a stock. And the way that it interacts and its implications within the model are different. And that's what you don't see in a causal loop diagram that's evident in a stock and flow diagram. To be more, let's see, Janet asks, to be more specific, should I take a small segment of the larger project to illustrate the concepts? I'm not sure I have a whole context for that particular question. There are there are times when I build models that I have to take portions of the model and go build smaller constructs. There are times when I build the loops individually and then put them together afterwards, because in trying to build them all together at once, I become confused about how I'm thinking about things, so that I go ahead and in this particular instance, here is loop R1, here's R2, R3, or B3, B4, B5. I explicitly turned off the rest of the loops because trying to explain B6 with all of the rest of them in view, I thought would be confusing. So by looking at all of this and trying to explain B6, the rest of the loops get in the way, and I thought it easier to explain B6 if all I was looking at was B6. Janet, you said there was an earlier question related to that one. I'm not sure I can find it in the list of stuff that has gone by. Marcia asks, so there is a variable called sales in your example that impacts this too, right? Sales. In this one? No, in some, I don't know. I don't know, Marcia, I don't know what model you're talking about. All right. Sales impacts inventory. But when I'm thinking about the influence between production and inventory, to understand that particular influence, everything else doesn't exist. I define the relationship between production and inventory and describe it with everything else held constant. Now, so I define the relationship so that production adds to inventory. Done. Then I go ahead and I say, okay, what else influences inventory? All right, sales reduces inventory or subtracts from inventory. Fine. That's a balancing or a negative relationship. Now that I've defined the two of them, then I look at it and I say, okay, there are two things that are simultaneously influencing inventory, one of them being sales and one of them being production. In terms of thinking about just production, sales is a constant. It's not changing. So I look at production to say, here's how it influences inventory. And I define the relationship between the two of them without regard to sales. I hope that helps. Janet, I think so. Janet's asking a question about a particular project that she's working on, wanting to know if it's good to use for the overall project. And I would post it and have people comment on it. Okay. Another question? And then part of the benefit also brings with it a confusion that we have to learn to get over. Otherwise, the understanding that we're looking for just doesn't develop. And I wish that it was easier. Though the alternative is to operate blindly, I think, in that all of this stuff that's these influences are interacting. They're interacting, and they are influences whether or not we pay attention to them. So that if we can simply look at a situation one-dimensionally and act, which we have typically done, and the result is the situation usually gets worse, or we can endure the headaches associated with endeavoring to better understand the influences that are responsible for that situation being what it is, and learning about appropriate ways to interact with that set of relations so that we produce better results. This is, you're now running into what it is that causes people to shy away from systems thinking or systems dynamics, various systems disciplines, because it's not something that you learn on a weekend. Though I have continued to find that a systemic perspective is absolutely the best approach to understanding things, to act in a meaningful way. Let's see. George asks, it seems going directly to a stock and flow while using pictures and identifying limiting and balancing loops seems a simpler way to do things. In terms of developing one's own personal understanding, doing stock and flow diagrams is probably the most informed way to develop a model. The question then is, what do I share with the intended audience? To present stock and flow diagrams to an audience not familiar with them usually doesn't produce real good results. What one might do is to develop stock and flow diagrams as homework, to develop a solid understanding of the influences. And then when you meet with someone else, you develop a rich picture with them, as opposed to trying to convince them that you already figured out the answer. I have a friend in Sydney who says, everybody's models are ugly but your own. And there's some real insight in that statement. So that if I want someone to really understand a model, it's best for them to develop it. So rather than trying to convince somebody that this is the right model, it's often much better if I ask them to help me figure out how to create one. And in the process, it's generally amazing what I learn in the process, the questions that they ask, the perspectives that they bring to the situation that I just didn't think of. We are better together, as opposed to, believing I'm the Lone Ranger, because I'm not. I used to be in the work with organizations developing knowledge management systems, and we'd talk to support organizations, and we'd say, to the support engineers, is there somebody in your organization that's the go-to person? The person who, whenever you run into a problem that you just absolutely stumped, they're the person you go talk to. And there's always one or two of these people. And then you say, okay, is this person smarter than all of you put together? Which seems to be a thought that they had never thought of. And the answer is no. So that it's that realization that we can accomplish more together than any one of us alone. Okay. Took me a long time to get over my own ego. Got time for one or two more questions. Let's see. Stephen asks, will modeling with a group help to facilitate that shared learning? I have found repeatedly, Stephen, that it does. If you have a group of people focus on building a model, amazing things happen when they focus on the model as opposed to focusing on agreeing and disagreeing with each other. It gives them something outside of themselves to focus on, so that you're continuing to look at, I mean, it begins to move in the direction of dialogue, so that the group is collectively thinking about what the thoughts are as opposed to whose thoughts they are. And how is it that the pieces come together to make sense? And you find these situations where one person says, well, this is a positive influence on this, and the other person says, no, it's a negative influence on this. And oftentimes you sort it out and you find out that they're both right, that you actually have to add additional variables because they're making assumptions that haven't been made explicit in the diagram. So it's the places where the group disagrees on things that are the greatest opportunity for learning. So my short answer to your question, Stephen, is absolutely. Okay. Well, with that, I guess we'll call this session a day. And as I continue to say, as you work through the content, post your questions to the discussion thread. Will do my absolute best to provide a meaningful answer, and we'll continue to move forward. Take care, everyone. Bye.